The sun beamed down on Maplewood, casting a warm glow over the small town. Thaddeus Montgomery's flashy red sports car pulled into the town square, turning heads and raising eyebrows. The engine roared like a lion, announcing his arrival. Townspeople paused their daily routines, drawn to the sight of the newcomer, a figure who radiated wealth and confidence. What kind of person would drive such a car into their quiet town? As Thaddeus stepped out, he was flanked by a group of friends, their laughter echoing in the air. They seemed like a pack of wolves, hunting for amusement. "Look at this old-fashioned junk," Thaddeus shouted, pointing at Edith Wainwright's antique shop across the street. "Who even buys this stuff anymore?" His friends erupted in laughter, their voices mingling with the whispers of townsfolk who overheard the jibe. Inside the shop, the atmosphere was thick with history and memories. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, settling on carefully curated antiques. Thaddeus strolled through the aisles, his eyes scanning the items with thinly veiled disdain. "Seriously, who would want a scratched-up vase?" he scoffed, holding up a fragile piece as if it were worthless. His friends laughed harder, oblivious to the weight of their words. They did not see the elderly woman behind the counter, her face pale as she listened to the mockery. Edith Wainwright stood tall, her hands clasped tightly. She felt the sting of his comments, each word like a pinprick to her dignity. Yet, she maintained her composure. "These antiques hold stories, young man," she replied, her voice steady despite the hurt inside. "They are not just objects, they are pieces of our history." But Thaddeus waved her off, a smirk on his face, as his friends egged him on. As they left the shop, the door chimed behind them, the sound echoing in the silence that followed. Edith's heart sank. She had poured her life into that store, yet here was a young man who saw it all as nothing but a joke. How could he be so arrogant? Did he not understand the value of what he dismissed so easily? Outside, the townspeople exchanged glances. They had witnessed the scene unfold, and whispers spread like wildfire. "Did you hear how he treated Edith?" One woman murmured to her friend. "It's disgraceful." Another added, "He thinks he can come in here and mock our traditions." Solidarity blossomed among them, their hearts united in support of the beloved shopkeeper. Meanwhile, Thaddeus basked in the thrill of the moment, not realizing the consequences of his arrogance. Laughter and cheers from his friends filled his ears, drowning out the murmurs of discontent from the townsfolk. But as the day wore on, a strange feeling began to creep into his chest. Was it loneliness? He looked around at his friends, their faces lit with excitement, yet he felt a void, as if something important was missing. That night, as he lay in bed, the laughter faded from his mind, replaced by an unsettling silence. His family had always told him he was special, that he was destined for greatness, but was this what greatness looked like? He thought of the townspeople, their disappointed faces, and Edith's quiet dignity. The contrast between the warmth of the community and his own cold arrogance began to gnaw at him. Could he really be so blind to their stories, their lives? Questions swirled in his mind, echoing in the dark. What did it mean to belong? Was he truly better than those he mocked? As he drifted into sleep, the sun set on Maplewood, casting long shadows that hinted at the changes yet to come. Would Thaddeus Montgomery ever understand the weight of his arrogance? Or would he remain lost in his own world, blind to the richness surrounding him? The answers, like the fading light, remained just out of reach. As the sun continued to shine over Maplewood, the townspeople gathered in small groups, their whispers rising and falling like the gentle breeze. The laughter from Thaddeus Montgomery and his friends had faded, but the sting of his words lingered in the air. Edith Wainwright's antique shop, usually a cozy haven filled with treasures, now felt heavy with the weight of humiliation. "Did you hear what that Montgomery boy said?" Mrs. Jenkins, a longtime resident, asked her neighbor, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I did," Mr. Thompson replied, shaking his head. "No respect for the past, that one." The townspeople formed a protective circle around Edith, who stood behind the counter, trying to maintain her composure. Despite the embarrassment, She held her head high. "Edith, you know we love your shop," said Sarah, the local librarian. "Don't let him get to you." "He's just a rich kid who doesn't understand the value of history," added Tom, the town carpenter. "We all know what this place means to us." Edith managed a small smile, grateful for their support. "Thank you, everyone. It means a lot." As the days passed, rumors of Thaddeus's arrogance spread like wildfire. Former friends whispered behind closed doors, wondering if they should distance themselves from him. His family, too, began to worry about his behavior. "Thaddeus, are you sure you want to act this way?" his mother asked one evening, concern etched on her face. "This isn't how we raised you." He shrugged, brushing off her words. "They don't understand. They cling to their old ways. I'm just having fun." But deep inside, a feeling of loneliness began to creep in. As Thaddeus drove through Maplewood in his flashy car, he noticed the smiles on the faces of those who gathered at Edith's shop. They shared stories and laughter, a community bound by history and respect. He felt a twinge of emptiness, a stark contrast to his superficial thrill. "Look at them," he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel. "They act like they're better than me just because they have their antiques and traditions." Yet, as he parked and stepped out, he noticed the way they stood together, united against his mockery. There was warmth in their laughter, a connection he had never truly understood. That evening, Thaddeus sat alone in his large, empty house. The walls felt cold and unwelcoming. He scrolled through social media, seeing posts from his former friends, chatting and laughing together. "This is pathetic," he said aloud, frustration growing. "Why do I even care what they think?" But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the echo of his laughter in Edith's shop haunted him. He recalled the look on her face, the way her smile faltered. "What have I done?" he whispered, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Meanwhile, the townspeople continued to rally around Edith. They organized a small gathering in her shop to show their support. "Let's show her how much we appreciate her," Sarah suggested. "We can bring our own antiques and share stories." As the day of the gathering approached, Thaddeus found himself drawn to the sound of laughter and conversation that wafted through the air whenever he drove by. He felt a strange mix of anger and envy. "Why can't I have that?" he thought bitterly. But there was a small voice in the back of his mind, whispering that maybe he could. Maybe there was a way to bridge the gap between his wealth and their warmth. As he walked through Maplewood, he noticed the little things he had overlooked before, the way Mrs. Jenkins greeted him with a smile, or how children played freely in the park. These moments were filled with a joy he had not experienced in a long time. He sighed, feeling a flicker of something he had long buried. Perhaps he needed to change. Perhaps he needed to understand the value of community. And so, with each passing day, the loneliness began to overshadow his arrogance, hinting at the possibility of a different path, one that might lead him to the heart of Maplewood and its people. Thaddeus Montgomery sat alone in his sleek sports car, the engine purring softly as he stared at the antique shop across the street. The bright sun shone down on Maplewood, but it did little to warm the chill in his heart. He had just learned something that shook him to his core. His grandmother had a history with Edith Wainwright's shop, a place he had mocked only days before. The thought of it made his stomach twist. "Why didn't I know this before?" he murmured to himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Memories of his grandmother flooded his mind, but they were faint and fuzzy. He was not close to her, and now he realized how little he understood about his own family history. As he stepped out of the car, he felt the eyes of the townspeople on him once more. They whispered and exchanged glances, their murmurs filled with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Thaddeus took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He walked toward the shop, each step heavy with the weight of his past arrogance. Inside, the shop was filled with the scent of aged wood and polished metal. The walls were lined with antiques, each piece telling a story of its own. Thaddeus spotted Edith arranging some delicate china, her movements graceful, yet weary. She looked up, and their eyes met. For a moment, silence filled the room. Thaddeus, she said, her voice steady but holding a hint of caution. What brings you here? I need to talk to you, he stammered, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks. I've learned something about my grandmother's connection to this place. I didn't know, and I'm sorry for how I acted before. Edith's expression softened, but the hurt in her eyes remained. It's not easy to forget what you said, she replied quietly, placing the china down. You dismissed everything I hold dear. I know, Thaddeus replied, guilt washing over him. I was wrong. I didn't understand the value of the things in this shop or your dedication to them. I want to learn more. Edith paused, weighing his words. Learning takes time, Thaddeus. It's not just about knowing facts, it's about understanding feelings and histories. I get that now, he insisted, desperate to bridge the gap between them. My grandmother loved this place. I can see that it meant something to her. I want to know why. With a sigh, Edith motioned for him to sit down at a small table in the corner. All right, let's start there. What do you remember about your grandmother? Thaddeus leaned back in his chair, recalling fleeting moments. She used to tell me stories when I was little, but they were always about her life, never about her past. I never thought to ask. Edith nodded, her expression softening further. She had a special fondness for the antiques. Each piece has a story, a connection to someone's life. Your grandmother understood that. She often came here to find treasures and share her joy with others. Thaddeus listened intently, a newfound respect dawning in him. What kind of treasures? Like this, Edith said, picking up a small, intricately carved wooden box. Your grandmother bought this from me years ago. She said it reminded her of her childhood, of the games she played with her siblings. What happened to it? Thaddeus asked, leaning closer. It's been here, waiting for someone to appreciate it again, Edith replied, placing the box gently back on the table. It's part of her story, and now it's part of yours too. Feeling a mix of regret and hope, Thaddeus said, I want to honor her memory. I want to understand this place and its stories. Edith studied him for a moment, then smiled softly. That's a good start, Thaddeus. Understanding begins with respect. If you're willing, I can share more stories. Together, we can uncover the past. Thaddeus felt a spark of relief. I would like that. Thank you, Edith. As they talked, Thaddeus began to see the beauty in the antiques around him. Each piece held a story, each story a lesson. He realized that his grandmother's connection to the shop was not just about the items, but about love, community, and shared history. In that small shop, he felt the stirrings of a connection he had long ignored, and he was ready to embrace it. Thaddeus Montgomery stood outside Edith Wainwright's antique shop, his heart racing with uncertainty. The sun cast long shadows on the pavement, and the vibrant colors of Maplewood seemed to mock his nervousness. He had spent the last few days thinking about his actions, his words that had hurt Edith and the town. Now, he gathered the courage to step inside. Taking a deep breath, Thaddeus pushed the door open. The familiar sound of the bell chimed above him, and he felt a wave of warmth wash over him, mixed with tension. The shop was filled with antiques, each piece telling a story of its own. But today, the stories felt heavy, burdened by the weight of his past arrogance. Edith stood behind the counter, her hands busy arranging a display of delicate porcelain figurines. She looked up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Thaddeus noticed the flicker of surprise in her gaze, quickly replaced by a more guarded expression. Thaddeus, she said, her voice steady but cool. What brings you here? He stumbled over his words. I wanted to talk to you. I owe you an apology. Edith raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. An apology? After what you said the other day? I know I hurt you, he replied, his voice earnest. I dismissed your work and the things you care about. I was wrong. She paused, studying him for a moment. Why now? What has changed? Thaddeus hesitated. I found out about my grandmother's connection to this shop. I didn't realize how much it meant to her and to me. It made me think about my actions. Edith's expression softened slightly, but she remained cautious. You laughed at something that holds a lot of history for many people, including your family. It's not easy to forget that. I understand that now, he said, stepping closer to the counter. I want to learn more about the antiques. I want to understand the value they hold, not just in money, but in memories, in community. Edith studied him, her eyes searching for sincerity. It's not just about understanding, it's about respect. You need to show that you truly care. I want to, Thaddeus replied earnestly. I'm ready to listen. I'm ready to learn. Very well, she said, her tone softening further. Let's take a look around. Each piece here has its own story. I'll share some of them with you. As they walked through the shop, Edith pointed to a beautiful oak chest. This belonged to a family that lived here over 100 years ago. They used it to store their precious belongings. It was a symbol of their hopes and dreams. Thaddeus listened intently, his earlier bravado fading away. I never thought about it that way, he admitted. I only saw old things, not stories. Many people do, Edith replied, but that's what makes this place special. It's about the people who came before us. They moved to a shelf lined with glass figurines. These were handcrafted by a local artist, Edith continued. Each one is unique. They represent the creativity and spirit of our community. Thaddeus felt a stirring in his heart. I can see it now. I've been so focused on my own life that I forgot about the people around me. Edith nodded, a hint of a smile forming on her lips. Understanding comes from listening and sharing. It seems you're starting to realize that. I want to help, Thaddeus said, his voice filled with determination. I want to give back to this community. I want to support the shop and the people in it. Edith regarded him thoughtfully. That's a start, Thaddeus. But remember, it will take time to rebuild trust. Actions speak louder than words. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, he promised. I want to show everyone that I'm serious about this. As their conversation continued, Thaddeus felt a warmth growing inside him. He realized that he was beginning to appreciate not just the antiques, but also the community they represented. The visit to Edith's shop was no longer just about making amends. It was about discovering a new part of himself. Thank you for sharing this with me, Edith, he said genuinely. I hope I can be a part of this community, not just as a visitor, but as someone who cares. Edith smiled, a spark of hope igniting in her eyes. That's all I ask, Thaddeus. Welcome to the journey of understanding. Thaddeus Montgomery stood outside Edith Wainwright's antique shop, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. The sun shone brightly over Maplewood, casting a warm glow on the quaint storefront. Today was the day he would take a step towards making things right. He took a deep breath, adjusting his shirt as he prepared to enter. As he pushed the door open, the small bell jingled above him, and the familiar scent of aged wood and antiques filled the air. Edith looked up from behind the counter, surprise etched on her face. Thaddeus, she said softly, her voice cautious. Hi, Edith, he replied, trying to keep his tone light. I wanted to talk to you. I've been thinking a lot about, well, everything. Edith raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism in her gaze. Is that so? What brings you here today? I want to help, Thaddeus said, his voice firming with purpose. I'd like to organize an event in your shop. We can showcase the antiques and invite the townspeople to share their stories about them. I think it could be fun and meaningful. Edith studied him for a moment, her expression softening. That's quite a change from the last time you were here. Why the sudden interest in my shop and the community? Thaddeus took a step closer, his heart racing. I've realized how wrong I was. I let my arrogance cloud my judgment. I want to learn more about my family's past and the people in this town. I want to make amends. A flicker of hope crossed Edith's face. If you truly mean that, we could use your help. The stories behind these antiques are precious. They connect us all. Then let's do it together, Thaddeus replied, a smile breaking through his earlier tension. I'll take care of the invitations and decorations. You can focus on sharing the stories. Edith nodded, a small smile appearing on her lips. All right, Thaddeus, let's give this a try. Over the next few days, Thaddeus poured himself into the planning. He printed colorful invitations and distributed them around town, personally inviting people to the event. He shared stories about the antiques with anyone who would listen, hoping to spark interest and excitement. As the day of the event approached, Thaddeus noticed a shift in the community's response. People who once avoided him were now curious. They began to see him not just as the arrogant newcomer, but as someone willing to change. On the day of the event, the shop buzzed with energy. Townsfolk mingled, laughter spilling over as they explored the carefully arranged antiques. Thaddeus watched as Edith shared stories about the pieces, her passion evident. He felt a warm glow inside, a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. "Thaddeus," a voice called. It was Jenny, a girl he had once dismissed at a party. "This is amazing. I didn't know the stories behind these items." She held up an ornate vase, her eyes wide with wonder. "Thank you, Jenny," Thaddeus replied, beaming with pride. "Edith has a way of bringing these pieces to life." As the evening unfolded, Thaddeus found himself drawn into conversations, sharing laughs and listening to stories. He felt a connection building with the community, one that he had never had before. "Thaddeus, I'm glad you're here," Edith said, joining him as the event continued. "You've brought a new energy to the shop. The townspeople are really opening up." "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You showed me the value of these stories," he said sincerely. "I want to keep doing this. I want to be part of this community." Edith smiled, her eyes shining with approval. "That's all I ever wanted, Thaddeus. To see you embrace what matters." As the sun set, casting a golden hue over Maplewood, Thaddeus felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had taken the first steps towards building bridges, not just with Edith, but with the entire community. The warmth that surrounded him was a stark contrast to the emptiness he had felt just weeks before. With renewed purpose, Thaddeus knew that this was just the beginning of his journey towards humility and connection, a journey he was eager to continue. The sun set over Maplewood, casting a warm glow on the quaint streets. At Edith Wainwright's antique shop, the air buzzed with excitement as townspeople gathered for the event Thaddeus Montgomery had organized. Colorful lights hung from the ceiling, and tables were filled with vintage items, each with its own story to tell. Thaddeus stood at the entrance, his heart racing. He had never felt so nervous in his life. "Are you ready for this?" asked his friend Jake, who had come to support him. Thaddeus nodded, a smile breaking through his nervousness. "I hope I can make a difference today." As the townsfolk filed in, Thaddeus noticed the warm smiles and friendly chatter. They seemed happy to be there, and he felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. Edith, standing beside him, beamed with joy. The shop had never looked so vibrant. "Thank you for all your hard work, Thaddeus," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I never thought I would see so many people here." "It's all about the stories we share," Thaddeus replied. "I wanted everyone to feel connected to this place." As the evening progressed, Thaddeus took it upon himself to introduce the antiques to the guests. "This piece here," he said, pointing to an ornate clock, "was made in the early 1900s. It belonged to Edith's grandmother. Can you believe it has been ticking for over a century?" The crowd gasped, intrigued by the history behind the items. Thaddeus felt a sense of joy wash over him as they gathered around, listening intently. He turned to Edith, who watched him with pride. "You have a gift for this," Edith said softly. "You make the past come alive for them." "Thanks, Edith," Thaddeus replied, feeling a warmth in his chest. "I've learned so much from you." As the night continued, stories flowed freely. A grandmother shared how she had played with a doll from the shop as a child, while a young couple marveled at an old typewriter. reminiscing about their passion for writing. Thaddeus listened to every word, each story further weaving him into the fabric of the community he had once mocked. Suddenly, he noticed a group of familiar faces in the corner, his former friends. They watched him with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Taking a deep breath, he walked over to them. "Hey, everyone," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm glad to see you all here." One of them, Mark, raised an eyebrow. "Didn't expect to see you involved in something like this, Thaddeus." "I know," Thaddeus admitted, feeling vulnerable. "I've been a jerk in the past. I'm trying to make things right." "Really?" another friend, Sarah, asked. "What changed?" With sincerity, Thaddeus replied, "I realized how important this community is. I want to honor my family's legacy and be a part of it, not just a distant observer." Their expressions softened, and Mark nodded. "It's good to see you stepping up. We've missed you around here." A sense of relief washed over Thaddeus. As he returned to Edith, he felt lighter. "I think they might be starting to come around," he said, a hint of hope in his voice. "I could see it in their eyes," Edith replied. "You're doing wonderfully, Thaddeus." As the night drew to a close, Thaddeus and Edith stood outside the shop, watching the last of the guests leave, their laughter lingering in the cool night air. "Tonight was a success," Thaddeus said, a smile spreading across his face. "I finally feel like I belong." Edith nodded, her eyes sparkling. "And you've made a difference, not just for yourself, but for everyone here. You've shown them that you care." Thaddeus took a moment to reflect. "I want to keep this going. I want to help more, to learn more about my family and this town." Edith placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's the spirit, Thaddeus. Together, we can build a new legacy." With a renewed sense of purpose, Thaddeus vowed to honor his family's past while cherishing the connections he had built. Maplewood was no longer just a place. It was home. Share this story if you believe that finding your place in the community can lead to personal transformation. Leave a comment about a time when reconnecting with your roots made a difference in your life, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one.